So yesterday I was trying to help someone debug a Node.js service in their Docker containers, and we were coming across an error that was being logged out, and the stack trace in the error pointed to a portion of the code that actually didn't offer much insight into why the error was being thrown. And the reason that was because the error was being created on a different line than it was actually being thrown. And if we look at the Node.js documentation, what we can see is that the stack trace, or error.stack, indicates which line the error is actually created on. It has nothing to do with when the error is actually thrown. So what happens is, if we separate the two gestures, the construction of an error object and the throwing of an error object, then we end up creating somewhat obfuscated stack traces, which may or may not be helpful in a debugging process. And to see this in action, let's take a look at what this code is doing. So I'm creating an error object here on line 6, and you can see I'm dealing with some values, and I have some conditional checks. Here we're looking at the actual value that was produced, and then I'm using those conditional checks to augment the error object with a new property, and then I'm throwing the error here. And if we jump over into the terminal and we try to run this, what we can see is that the stack trace indeed points to line 6, but really gives very little indication as to where in the control flow the error object was actually thrown. Now, we do coincidentally see in the console.error here that this random value of high is being appended, which of course does give us some insight into where in the control flow this is being generated. But this object may not be output if, say, for example, we're using a log serializer that doesn't look at standard, that doesn't look at non-standard error properties, or perhaps this value just isn't giving us enough insight. Like perhaps there's a bunch of conditions that all use the same value, so on and so forth. The point is that you shouldn't decouple the creation of an error and the throwing of an error. These two gestures should really be done in a single expression. And if you need to augment an error object, I would suggest that instead of trying to augment the core error instance, you should actually create a subclass of that provides for more constructor parameters that you can then provide as you're throwing. So something like, if you had throw new app error, right, and here we would put in high, right, something like that, so that we could then combine the throwing and the construction of the error object and provide for, I guess this would have to have like some message as well, right? Something like that, where we can now create a more predictable error structure that allows us to once again combine the throwing and the construction of the error object. So anyway, this is just something interesting that I had come across in someone's code, and it did make debugging quite a bit more difficult. So just a suggestion to always keep the construction of error objects and the throwing of error objects in a single expression in order to have the stack trace point to the actual line in which the error is thrown, not just in which it's created.